You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 28th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, the Democratic Republic of Congo accuses its neighbour Rwanda of declaring war. We'll have the latest on an escalation of a decades-long period of conflict and uncertainty. Also coming up, the British Prime Minister joins a meeting of the EU's leaders for the first time since Brexit. Are we really looking at a reset, though? Plus, why no one is surprised that Denmark's boosting its security setup, and we head to the Royal Academy of Arts here in London to hear about the birth of Brazilian modernism. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Let's begin the programme with this accusation by the Democratic Republic of Congo at its neighbour Rwanda that it's declared war. M23 rebels, backed by the Rwandan government, have crossed the DRC's eastern border and have mounted an assault on the city of Goma. Well, Goma is the capital of North Kivu, which is an important mining region and a big supplier of metals that are widely used in everyday items such as smartphones. Well, to tell us more about what's happening, joining me from Cape Town is Daniel van Dalen. He's a senior country risk analyst at Signal Risk. Good afternoon, Daniel.
Hi, Emma.
So is this a declaration of war?
I think there's been a lot of exchange of words on both sides. And I don't think this is effectively the first time the war term has been used. I think it's more just a case of a threat. Rwanda has effectively, Rwandan troops have effectively been in the DRC since at least 2022 supporting M23. So the recent events are rather an escalation of that. Obviously, the advance onto Goma is a bit of a red line diplomatically. Obviously, effectively, you are taking hold of the diplomatic center of that section of the country. We've seen diplomatic personnel having to evacuate. It's a strategic city overall for the military. So like I said, I think it's more of an exchange of words, given that things are obviously quite tense at the moment, but I don't think it's a formal declaration on either side, firmly stating that, we're now going to engage in open conflict.
Daniel, just explain to us who the M23 militia are and why they are taking hold of Goma.
So M23 dates back to a Rwandan-leaning group that was kind of part of the Congo Wars, and since then they've kind of morphed into this rebel group. Already in 2012, they sought to siege Goma and take over sections of North Kivu. At the time, we saw South African forces, along with the United Nations and other African forces, basically kick them out. Rwanda at the time was also supporting them, and a lot of evidence came at that point that Rwanda was actually one of the main reasons that they propped up and went from what was largely, a small rebel group and a political grouping to, this kind of large organization that you see now. As with in 2012, the argument that they've kind of made is that, we are seeking to protect the interests of the Tutsi minority in North Kivu from the FDLR Hutu extremist group, which have links to, the regime in Rwanda that orchestrated the genocide. In 2012, the FDLR was borderline defeated. So the justification that M23 is using now is not really applicable, but that is the stance that they're still making. Yes, the FDLR is still around, but at this stage, it seems that M23, with help of Rwanda, is planning a long-term occupation in an area that you mentioned does have loads of minerals. Since M23's occupation, we've seen Rwanda's mineral exports increase substantially. They are exporting minerals they do not have. So, while there may be a component that they do view this group as a threat, there is definitely a fiscal component and a motivation to kind of seize territory that can advance their interests.
And is it believed that M23 only are interested in the likes of North Kivu because it is so valuable financially, or is there any sense that they want to go further? After all, the DRC is geographically an enormous country.
Yeah, it is massive. So we've already seen them go south to South Kivu province. They've already taken hold of a border town there. As we've seen the advance of Goma progress, they have said they will not stop there. They aim to move to Kinshasa, which is thousands of kilometers away. That is not an easy feat. I think it is a case of that is an easy way to justify what they're doing of, oh, we are a traditional rebellion. We are looking for our interests in this part of the region. And therefore the other government should be toppled so we can protect these guys. But, I think at this stage, it's more of a way to justify what they're doing. We can topple this government. Meanwhile, we're probably still going to stick here. They don't have the resources to get all the way to Kinshasa. Even if Rwanda supported that, it's a huge task. And it would obviously result in massive external kind of responses, which have been largely absent for now. But I think that would be quite a red line in the sand if we saw a big push towards, the west of the country, towards Kinshasa.
We have seen international fatalities here. We've seen 4 South African peacekeepers killed. What does that signify?
So we've actually we've had 14 South African soldiers killed so far. Some of them from a regional intervention force, which is from the SADC region. So they're not a peacekeeping force. They were actually deployed there to assist the Congolese military in fighting M23. We've also then had Malawian peacekeepers and South African peacekeepers as part of the United Nations mission also killed. That obviously does change dynamics when you have external actors killed in a conflict like this. At least on the side of South Africa, our government has been quite slow to respond. Communications has been quite, atrocious, if I have to say it like that. South Africans, half of us, you could, probably didn't even know we were there. So suddenly we're seeing reports of South African, soldiers being killed in the DRC. But like I said, South Africa's response has been quite muted. SADC has also been quite muted, even though it's that force. So I don't necessarily see the death of our soldiers prompting a major escalation between South Africa and Rwanda, for example.
Looking at what the international community can and is doing, we saw an emergency UN Security Council meeting on this subject happen a couple of days ago. The UK and the US called on Rwanda to withdraw the M23 forces. China merely urged an end to hostilities. Why would China do that?
I think every country has taken its own approach depending on who their partners are. At the end of the day, you can also tell by Russia's response as well. At the end of the day, Russia is obviously talking about the Rwanda propaganda that's come out. I think China's trying to take a bit more of a middle ground position. It has ties to Rwanda. It obviously has massive ties to the DRC through these mining contracts. So each country definitely has its own interests within the DRC and in the wider region, and their responses are quite telling in that regard. I think in the West, they feel compelled, especially with what you see in Ukraine and that kind of thing, to say, okay, well, we're looking for something a bit more concrete. But somewhere where China, where it's trying to balance its interests, it's not going to see itself as trying to take a side to ensure that, it can still maintain relations with both countries.
Daniel Van Dalen, Senior Country Risk Analyst at Signal Risk. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. And for more on the conflict in the DRC, what the stakes are, how we got here, do tune in to our brand new episode of The Foreign Desk, which will premiere at Saturday at noon here in London. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. It's time now to take a look at the day's other news headlines. Here's Tom Webb.
Thanks, Emma. Serbian Prime Minister Milos Vučević has resigned following months of protests over a deadly awning collapse in November that killed 15 people. Vučević's resignation came just one day after President Alexander Vučić said an urgent and extensive reconstruction of the government was in the works. It was in response to the demands posed by Serbia's striking university students. Japan's Fuji Media has been seeking to rebuild its tarnished reputation by holding a 10-hour press conference in Tokyo, attended by hundreds of journalists. It follows allegations that a former J-pop star sexually harassed a woman while he was working for the broadcaster as a television host. Britain and the European Union are in court for the first time to resolve a dispute over post-Brexit fishing rights, a case that could complicate Britain's planned reset of relations with the bloc. The panel will hear arguments from both sides for 3 days on whether a British ban on fishing sand eels in its North Sea waters breaches the EU-UK trade and cooperation agreement. Drivers in Zurich will soon be able to purchase their own personalised number plates under plans announced by the canton. Authorities also confirmed that 7-digit plates will be rolled out in the next 2 years. It comes as Canton Zurich is running out of licence plates to issue. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Now, remember, Brexit means Brexit, the impenetrable slogan coined by the Conservative government when the UK voted leave and then had to negotiate the terms of its departure from the EU. Well, one thing it certainly achieved was to make sure the shutters were pulled down firmly between London and Brussels. But with a new Labour government in power since last July, there are new opportunities on the horizon. And next week, for the first time since the UK left the EU, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, becomes the first British leader since Brexit to attend a meeting of the European Council's 27 leaders. Well, joining me now down the line from London is Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, political reporter for Politics Home. Good afternoon, Nadine.
Good afternoon.
So this does not mean a full rapprochement, does it?
No, I mean, it looks as if Labour is doing what was widely expected, which is trying to kind of create a closer relationship with the European Union. The economic situation facing this government at the moment is pretty dire. We know that growth is forecast to be pretty stagnant. And with that, the government has to look elsewhere to kind of find that economic growth it needs to fulfil what the agenda that it has. And at the moment, the tax receipts and the income that they've got coming in just doesn't match that. And we could be facing public spending cuts. So growth is increasingly, you're going to hear more about that from this government, and a close relationship with the EU is integral to that. Obviously, though, it does feel like a bit like opening an old can of worms, which no one wants to do, particularly not this Labour Party, which is quite cautious. So how Labour do this careful choreography is going to be very interesting to see in the weeks and months.
They've already said that they're not going to rejoin free movement of people and indeed the customs union, which is effectively, one of the great 4 pillars of the European Union itself. So what is Keir Starmer hoping will be an opportunity, that moment when a door opens, even if it is only so far?
Yeah, I think it's more building those relationships and having the EU open to maybe making concessions or working more closely without making the UK have to be part of that customs arrangement. I mean, you have to look back to the relationship that the previous government had with the EU. Liz Truss famously, when she was elected, said she didn't know if Emmanuel Macron was a friend or foe. So there's a lot of kind of rebuilding to be done there. And Labour does have goodwill with the EU when it comes to, trying to get more favourable terms in that respect. They're starting from a better point than the previous Conservative government did, because so many Conservative prime ministers were so hawkish. And the latest kind of iteration of the attempt to build relations seems to be this emission and trading scheme, where he's trying to kind of reset relations there by trying to discuss better ways of building kind of cooperation on things to do with like carbon markets and making sure that there's not kind of almost like a tax put on kind of a carbon trading. But the problem is, will the EU want to do this? There's questions of fishing. The UK currently allows kind of EU countries to fish in UK waters. This has been a bone of contention for parties like UKIP, and then more recently parties like the Brexit Party and Reform, and some of course of the Conservative Party, who say, Brexit means Brexit. These are UK waters. Many people who voted for Brexit wanted autonomy over British waters. The EU has said that access to British fishing waters is one of their red lines. So there's a lot to be done. Whether Labour can actually get this better relationship they want remains to be seen, but there is arguably much more goodwill than there was with the previous government.
How much is this actually, and you mentioned the moment, about what is in it for the EU. So we have this position now, don't we, that, as you just mentioned, you can have as much goodwill as you like, and there was this enormous sort of charm offensive after Labour got in. There were, I think, Starmer met the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz 5 times within 3 months of taking office. Then we had a rather interesting video of Keir Starmer showing Emmanuel Macron while round Chequers, the country residence, and showing him Winston Churchill's seat, his chair. This looks good, but that working out of the detail, overcoming problems, deciding a future, where do both sides begin here? Because there is still an awful lot of bad blood, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think it fundamentally comes down to what's economically mutually beneficial. And we know that we're not the only country in Europe, in the European area at the moment, having problems with their economy. Germany has seen pretty miserable growth. Many European countries have been struggling with inflation. There's obviously this pressure to move towards net zero that all Western countries have kind of committed to, but or struggling to kind of reach. And so, looking at things like ensuring that, the carbon markets aren't completely separated, and therefore that, when we're exporting to each other, importing from each other, there aren't extra costs. That's a mutually beneficial move. However, the kind of more Eurosceptic-y people would say, well, we're supposed to be completely divorced from the EU. We shouldn't have any sort of arrangement that we wouldn't have with other countries. Why are we treating them any differently? So there will constantly be that questioning, and how far Labour can go without drawing any heat from the more Eurosceptic people that sticks. But fundamentally, it will come down to what is mutually beneficial for the UK and the EU. Obviously, some people would argue rejoining the single market and the common market and being back in the EU is what's mutually beneficial for everybody. That's not going to happen. The British people made that quite clear, that they wanted to leave the European Union. So what can an arrangement that's palatable to both sides, both politicians and the people, look like that's mutually beneficial to both sides? And I think that's where the negotiations will be going. Where it ends up remains to be seen. Goodwill doesn't mean you're going to get great deals and great arrangements, but it's a better starting point than where Liz Truss and Sunak and Johnson were, certainly.
The interesting thing is that one wonders where Starmer will start with this, because we have the EU negotiates as a bloc, and that is obviously its tremendous strength. But are there any personal relationships that Starmer can build upon here?
Yeah, I think with the leaderships in in the major countries like France and Germany, but obviously they're each facing their own instability. There's a German election imminent. France has obviously had some political turmoil, so it's a difficult time for Starmer to be building those closer relationships with European leaders, particularly when it seems as if there is a kind of shift towards the right in some of these countries. And obviously Starmer is left of centre, and we see the same with the States as well. Now we've got Trump in the White House, when we've got a centre left government here, it poses challenges when it comes to relationship building. So that's why I think there's only so far having a positive relationship can go. But I always think money talks when it comes to politics, and money and the economy is always most important. And I think regardless of whoever's in various countries, that will take priority. But it just might mean it might be harder to negotiate than if there was somebody maybe more amicable and more friendly.
Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us on Monocle Radio. You with the briefing. Time for a look at the business news with Ewan Potts, Bloomberg reporter, regular briefing contributor. Good afternoon, Ewan.
Hi, good to speak to you.
Are you all mopping your brows after yesterday?
Well, yeah, I think that would probably be a pretty fair assessment. It was quite the tech sell-off yesterday. The Nasdaq ended down 3%, so not cataclysmic. But if you look under the surface, some of the stock moves were really quite incredible. What was the world's most valuable company when we started the session and is no longer, Nvidia, the big American chip maker, lost 17% of its value yesterday. Now, in terms of market capitalization, that was a $600 billion wipeout. In fact, the largest loss of stock market value for a single stock in stock market history. Now, the thing that roiled Nvidia and the rest of the market was a Chinese app called DeepSeek. Now, most of us hadn't heard of this until yesterday. We were all frantically downloading it and Googling it. I actually did a little test on my phone. I downloaded this app. It's a competitor to ChatGPT. So it's a large language model AI app, which is supposed to have the answer to everything. And I asked it, perhaps with a touch of existential angst, I asked it, what's driving tech stocks down today? Which I thought would be basically it's you. So I thought it would be a fairly straightforward question. And it told me basically to look online for the latest stock moves. So it failed that test. I wasn't very impressed with that answer. I then asked the same thing of ChatGPT, and it gave me a quite coherent answer. But that was just one small test, not scientific. But actually, what really concerned the market is that the proper research, the proper testing suggests that this app is almost as effective as ChatGPT, which of course has had billions invested in it. And what's really significant is that it runs with about a 50th of the computing power. So far fewer chips, far less energy needed. And so suddenly the market thought, goodness, if this app can function properly on an absolute fraction of the chips used by other apps, then we're not going to need to build all these AI infrastructure. We're not going to need to buy all these chips. And of course, NVIDIA, the biggest supplier of AI chips, was really hit hard. But it wasn't just NVIDIA which was down yesterday. A lot of the rest of the AI infrastructure ecosystem also saw their shares hit, the likes of Siemens Energy in Germany and Schneider Electric in France, who are very involved in building data centers and the energy infrastructure around them. They also saw their stocks hit. So the market really reassessing what all this might mean for the AI infrastructure build out.
It also means that everybody's reassessing what it means for Donald Trump and the way that the US business world and the US economy is going to be structured for the next 4 years or so, because anybody who saw the inauguration of Donald Trump last week will see just how important he prizes his tech giants, inviting most of them to the rotunda to watch him being sworn in. But there's an article in the Financial Times this afternoon talking about the French bank Société Générale, SocGen, is pointing out that without NVIDIA and its top 4 customers, Microsoft, Google, Amazon and Meta, the entire US benchmark index would be 12% below what it is today, suggesting that there is an enormous reliance on AI and stock, and DeepSeek might just have exposed its vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think we're just at the start of exploring that, really. But the Magnificent Seven, the big 7 tech companies on the NASDAQ, account for a huge amount of the market capitalization in the United States. These are massive companies, some of them worth more than $1 trillion. And a lot of the gains we've seen over the last 2 years on the stock market, not all of them, but a lot of the gains attributed to the rise in the value of these massive tech companies. Now, I don't think we're going to see them crashing and burning. They're not going to go away. This isn't the dot-com bubble. These companies are very profitable. And the likes of NVIDIA and Meta, who own Instagram, the Google parent company, these are very profitable companies churning out billions of dollars in profits every quarter. So they're not about to sort of disappear. But the thing that happened yesterday is that investors suddenly saying that perhaps the certainty of this kind of massive AI boom, this massive AI rollout, which is going to involve hundreds of billions of dollars investment, Meta itself just this week saying they're spending a huge amount of money on the AI rollout. Suddenly, that's not quite so certain anymore. And investors are questioning just perhaps it might not be quite as big as we thought before. But as you say, very important to Donald Trump's agenda. And we had just Keir Starmer just this week saying how important AI is to the UK. The UK also seeking to become an AI hub. So it's really the talk of the markets and of politicians. But I think just a pause now to think just perhaps it might look a little bit different to how it did last week.
Ewan Potts, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Denmark is to spend $2 billion on boosting its security presence in the Arctic. It follows the US President Donald Trump's claims that he wants Greenland and the reportedly disastrous conversation last Friday between Mr. Trump and the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen. Well, joining me now is Michael Booth, Monocle's Copenhagen correspondent. Good afternoon, Michael. Good to have you on the programme.
Hi, Emma. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm very glad to have you to explain to us what's Denmark going to be spending the money on? And more importantly, where does it get $2 billion from all of a sudden?
Oh, that's not a problem at all for Denmark right now. Haven't you noticed they're making the world spin with their obesity drugs? So Denmark is extremely rich per capita. Problem is, in real terms, it simply can't compete with what America is offering the 56,000 Greenlanders at the moment. And since Trump has gone to play on Greenland and is making very, very scary noises towards it, the Danish politicians have gone into an absolute panic and are hurling money at Greenland, not just this £1.6 billion, but in a meeting last week with the Prime Minister of Greenland, Mette Frederiksen was promising more business cooperation and more partnerships. They've already built a new airport in Nuuk in Greenland, financed about 50% by the Danish government. And today, Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister, has been on a panic-stricken whistle-stop tour of European capitals. She started in Berlin this morning. I think right now she's just landed in Paris, and then she's going to go and meet with the NATO leaders in Brussels later today. They've absolutely gone into a tailspin in Denmark, in Copenhagen. But I have to say, I haven't met one single Dane, ordinary Dane in inverted commas, who really cares whether they still have any control over Greenland or not.
I think that might be a question for those who live in for the citizens of Greenland to answer themselves. But the fact that Mette Frederiksen is on this whirlwind tour, it's also being matched by the fact that the EU and NATO have agreed on a so-called, it's a vow of silence, namely they won't rise to the bait.
No, and there does seem to be, so far, and this is all guesswork on everyone's part, there seems to be a tentative solidarity amongst European leaders. Time will tell whether that holds up under pressure from America and whether America can play that game and split the EU in that way. I honestly have no idea, but certainly the Danes are running around at the moment trying to gather support and some kind of solidarity.
Tell me what a beefed-up security presence would look like in the Arctic, and whether, indeed, it could actually stop the Americans from helping themselves to Greenland.
Well, I think what Greenlanders will respond to this is that Denmark promised $1.5 billion worth of defence support in 2021, and virtually nothing happened. I think the joke goes they got some extra dog sled trips with the military there, and Trump has already joked about the fact that Denmark's defence capabilities are totally insignificant in terms of the area that they need to patrol. But Denmark is promising this time 3 new ships. But once again, Danes will roll their eyes at this because the Danish Navy has been through constant spending scandals, malfunction scandals, ships that can't fire missiles, ships that aren't manned. So the Danes take all of this with a pinch of salt as well. And again, what Denmark can offer, no matter how rich it's got from selling Wegovy to the world, it pales in comparison with what the American military can offer.
Michael Booth, Monocle's Copenhagen correspondent, thank you as ever for joining us on The Briefing. Finally on today's programme, today marks the opening of Brasil, with exclamation marks, the birth of modernism at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. The exhibition features 130 works by 10 of the most important Brazilian artists of the 20th century. And Monocle Radio's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, headed down to the exhibition to hear from Adrian Locke, chief curator of the RA, and Adam offered an explanation of the period covered in the show.
Brazil only became a republic in 1889. So Anita Malfatti, who's really the pioneer, if you like, of Brazilian modernism, is painting in the 1910s, 1915, 1916 or so. So Brazil is a very, very young country at this point, and I would say it's probably quite a conservative country in the sense with a small c in terms of art, and probably a preference for academic kind of trained artists. The traditional sort of landscapes or portraits or historical allegories. And then suddenly Anita Malfatti, who studied in Europe and in the United States, appears with a radically different proposition, which the critics hated and savaged her, in fact. But she really was the person who made or opened the door for everybody else to follow.
And talking about Anita, she's, one of the first here at the exhibition. It's divided into 11 artists, right? I love the way, by the way, even the font. You have to tell me about the design of the place. Yeah. It looks super cool.
So, 1944, there was an exhibition here at the Royal Academy, which was a diplomatic gesture from Brazil. Artists donated work that was to be sold for the benefit of the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund. Now, as part of that exhibition, the Anglo-Brazilian Society transferred an exhibition that had been in the Museum of Modern Art in New York called Brazil Builds. This was an exhibition that was of architecture in Brazil from the beginning to the most modern buildings. So you can imagine a vast array of kind of, Brazilian Baroque up to Niemeyer and the others. And the cover of the catalogue, which is in the first gallery, uses a graphic treatment which we wanted to use for this exhibition. So it sort of links back to 1944.
That's fantastic. And tell us about some of the artists. I love the work of Tarsila do Amaral. I mean, it's funny because it feels as fresh as ever. She's certainly one of my favorites, but I wonder if you can tell some of the other names here at the exhibition from the 11 artists.
Yeah, so, I mean, I would say today, Tarsila is probably the most well-known Brazilian artist, and I would imagine the most valuable in terms of auction prices. Of course, when the exhibition in 1944 happened, Cândido Portinari would have been the most famous Brazilian artist internationally. He'd had exhibitions in the United States, he'd had monographs printed in the United States. He was the sort of superstar of Brazilian art. But the selection of artists really kind of reflects on some of those artists that haven't had the most international exposure. Janira, for example, a self-taught artist with indigenous heritage. Rubem Valentim, an Afro-Brazilian artist. There's also Flávio de Carvalho, who's really quite new to me, who was a very maverick artist and undertook some of the first performance pieces in Brazil, public performances. Almost, you could say, if you look at his work, he's like a surrealist and quite unrelated to other artists working at that time. So it's quite an eclectic group. But I think the idea was to include artists of diverse backgrounds and artistic training. So Volpi, for example, is a self-taught artist, started out with these rather naive kind of views of Ouro Preto and other places, and then becomes more and more abstracted. So it's really quite a journey as well. You go from figuration, i.e. the representation of the world as you see it, through to abstraction, which is really exciting to see, I think.
And for me personally, I mentioned Tarsila do Amaral. I was expecting just to see the best of, which I did. But I also learned, as you mentioned, artists like Janira, even the work of Geraldo Barros. I didn't know much, I have to say. So I was like, even as a Brazilian, I was like surprised. So yeah. I think there was an amazing element of curation here.
Yeah, artists like Geraldo de Barros and Flávio de Carvalho are also like polymaths. You know, they did more than just paint or take photographs. They designed furniture, they designed buildings. So they were, and then Portinari, of course, famously worked in very close proximity with Roberto Burle Marx and Oscar Niemeyer on projects. So they were more than just straightforward artists, I suppose. Some of them are just classic painters or drawers and so on. But there's quite a range to different artists, and that also their backgrounds, their training. So it's kind of interesting to create a narrative of Brazilian modernism through the eyes of 10 artists. I mean, 11 if you include Burle Marx. But the idea, of course, is that Brazilian modernism was not a single entity. It wasn't just a movement. It was a kind of...
They're very different among each other, right?
Yeah, very different among each other, but also Brazilian modernism about music, it's about architecture, it's about literature, it's about film, which of course we can't cover. But it's essentially, I suppose one could say, it's the idea of artists and others engaging with, reflecting on and celebrating what it was to be Brazilian, rather than looking outside of Brazil.
And that was Adrian Locke, Chief Curator at the Royal Academy of Arts. And Brazil, with exclamation marks, the birth of modernism is at the Royal Academy in London now. And that was senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco doing the questions there as well. That's all the time we have for today's edition of The Briefing. Thanks to all my guests, and thanks to the producer Hassan Anderson. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. For now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.